Let me take you back 1400 years ago. Two names dominated the globe, Rome and Persia. Today you'd call them superpowers. Their armies were unstoppable. Their cities, fortresses, their leaders feared across continents. And in the middle of this chaos, in a desert with no running water, no centralized government, no army, and no name, stood a man. A man with no political title, no throne, no weapons of mass destruction. Only one thing, a message. And that message was Islam. Now pause. Let me ask you, how does a fragmented desert community go toe-to-toe with the world's largest empires and win? Because this isn't fiction, it's not motivational hype, it's history. Let me show you what really happened. Let's rewind the clock to the 6th and 7th century. If you lived back then, the idea of a tribe from Arabia rising up and shaking the world would have sounded like a joke. The world wasn't chaotic, it was controlled. Order was enforced by two iron fists, the Byzantine Empire in the west and the Sassanid Persian Empire in the east. These weren't just empires, they were superpowers. For centuries they dominated politics, warfare, trade, culture, and belief systems. The Byzantine successors of Rome were the mightiest Christian empire of the time. Centered in Constantinople, they inherited the Roman military system, engineering, law, and diplomacy. They controlled vast regions, modern-day Turkey, parts of the Middle East, North Africa, and Southern Europe. Their armies were professional, their cities heavily fortified, and their leaders were trained in both war and governance. This was a state that had faced off with barbarians, withstood invasions, and still stood tall. On the other side, the Sassanid Empire of Persia, elegant, fierce, and deeply proud of its ancient lineage. Persia had a centralized government, an organized military force, and a cultural legacy that traced back to the great kings. Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes. Their capital cities were masterpieces of architecture and administration. The Sassanids had an imperial ideology tied to Zoroastrianism, and a complex bureaucracy to support their rule. These two giants weren't just powerful, they were in a cold and hot war that lasted for generations. Battles along the borders, proxy wars, economic competition, spies, shifting alliances. It sounds like a modern geopolitical thriller, and yet they survived it all. Everyone around them either submitted or was smaller kingdoms, tribal confederations, and borderlands had one of two options: align with one or be crushed by both. Now here's where it gets wild. Amid this global standoff in a land completely ignored by both powers, Arabia, something extraordinary was happening. Arabia at the time was viewed as backwards, politically irrelevant, economically fragmented, culturally tribal. No king, no nation state, just warring clans, poetry competitions, tribal feuds, idol worship, and desert trade caravans. No unified military, no governing system, no exports besides incense and camels. Neither Rome nor Persia wanted it. Not even as a colony, it wasn't worth the trouble. The Hijaz region where Mecca and Medina are located today was geographically cut off from the centers of power. The Arabian Peninsula was considered ungovernable, too vast, too dry, too fractured. Nobody believed that anything serious could come from this region. But while the two empires were exhausting themselves in constant warfare, raising taxes, alienating their own populations, and overstretching their resources, something was growing quietly in the shadows. A man, a message, a mission. At the exact moment when the world was divided between two powers, when people were either Roman or Persian, when no third option existed, Islam was revealed to a man in a cave, not to a general, not to a king, not to a scholar, to someone from the margins of society in a town that barely made the map. And within just a few decades, this message would dismantle the unshakable. It would break borders that hadn't changed for centuries. It would convert citizens of the most powerful empires into believers of a new faith. It would bring justice where there was oppression, unity where there was tribal hatred, and discipline where there was chaos. It didn't just disrupt the world order, it replaced it. And that's why you have to understand, Islam didn't rise in a vacuum. It rose in the face of giants, and it beat them. not with size, not with force, but with truth, vision and unstoppable belief. At the time Islam emerged, the Arabian Peninsula was one of the most politically, socially and spiritually fractured regions on earth. It was a land defined by tribal warfare, deep-rooted rivalries and a complete absence of centralized governance. There was no king, no military alliance, no common law. Each tribe acted as its own authority, enforcing its own customs, fighting its own enemies, and defending its own honor was everything. Vengeance was a way of life, and blood feuds could last generations. This wasn't a society built on structure or long-term vision, it was survival in the rawest sense. Economically, Arabia was barely on the radar of the world's elite. Trade caravans passed through, yes, and cities like Mecca held some strategic value due to their location along trade routes. But the region wasn't known for wealth, innovation, or military strength. It was largely ignored by the superpowers of the day because it was considered unworthy of conquest. The harsh climate, lack of water, and nomadic culture made it more trouble than it was worth. Spiritually, the situation was just as bleak. Arabia was a melting pot of confused belief. Idolatry dominated Meccan society. Over 300 idols filled the Kaaba, each representing a different tribe or deity. Religion had become less about truth and more about tradition, politics, and profit. The spiritual vacuum was filled with superstition, corruption, and religious manipulation. The weak were exploited. Women were buried alive in some regions, and there was no moral compass to unify the people. Into this darkness came a man, Muhammad, who by all worldly standards had no power. He wasn't from a royal family. He didn't command armies. He didn't inherit wealth. He couldn't read or write. And yet he began to speak words that shook the foundations of that society. He claimed nothing for himself but carried a message that demanded everything from those who heard it, to submit to one God, to abandon their idols, to treat the weak with justice, and to let go of tribal arrogance. It sounded insane to the elite. No tribal gods, no intermediaries, no political manipulations. It was a direct challenge to the entire power structure of Mecca. But the power of this message wasn't in its politics, it was in its purity. It made people think, it made people question, and for the first time it gave people, especially the poor, the slaves, the women, the orphans, hope. That's why the early followers of Islam weren't kings or generals, they were the ones society had discarded. And what's shocking is this, they followed not because they were forced to, not because they were bribed, but because they were transformed. The message of Islam didn't just call them to believe, it called them to be better, to rise above their base instinct, to stop living for their tribe and start living for a greater purpose. Even though the Prophet Zalapala faced ridicule, torture, boycott and assassination attempts, he never gave up, he never compromised the message, he never chased political shortcuts or made deals with corrupt power brokers. Because his aim wasn't to build a tribal coalition, it was to awaken a sleeping humanity. And this awakening began to reshape the region, bit by bit, tribe by tribe, heart by heart. It started in the caves of Mecca, it grew in the house of El-Arqam, and it expanded in the fields of Badr and Uhud. It wasn't military power that built Islam, it was conviction, discipline, vision, a moral revolution in a place no one thought was capable of producing anything significant. So while the world looked at Arabia and saw weakness, Islam saw potential. And where others saw dust and poverty, the Prophet Zalapala saw a launching point for a movement that would reshape the earth. Because power doesn't always rise from palaces, sometimes it begins in silence, with nothing but belief. When we talk about history shaping leadership, we often think of emperors with vast armies, kings born into dynasties, or generals trained from childhood to lead men into battle. But the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad didn't follow that mold. His power didn't come from bloodline, wealth, or military tradition. It came from vision, from unshakable purpose, and from a deep connection to the people he led. What makes his leadership not only unique, but revolutionary, is how he transformed a scattered tribal people into a unified force driven not by conquest, but by conviction. In just 23 years the Prophet Zalapalapalapalasterme changed everything about the Arabian Peninsula. He wasn't just a messenger of divine revelation, he was a strategist, a statesman, a peacemaker, a commander, and above all, a servant leader. When he began his mission in Mecca, he had no institutional backing. He was mocked, rejected, and violently opposed. Yet through patience, clarity, and wisdom, he built a community bound not by tribe, blood, or territory, but by belief and shared values. His leadership style was relational. He didn't sit above the people, he sat among them. He lived simply, suffered with them, listened to their concerns, and led by example. In an age where authority meant domination, his authority came from love, trust, and consistency. People followed him not because they feared him, but because they believed in him and he believed in them. He saw potential in people no one else valued. He elevated Bilal, a former slave, to be the first muezzin. He gave leadership roles to people who were judged by society as outsiders. He treated the young with respect, and gave women dignity in a culture that often denied them basic humanity. But his leadership wasn't just moral, it was incredibly strategic. Every move he made was rooted in vision and deep insight into human psychology, tribal dynamics, and timing. Take the Treaty of Hudaybiyah for example. On the surface, it looked like a diplomatic law. Many companions were confused, even hurt. But the Prophet Zalapala saw beyond the immediate. That treaty bought time for Islam to grow, for the truth to reach more hearts, and for future conquests to happen with minimal bloodshed. Within 2 years, Mecca was opened peacefully. When the battles did come, Badr, Uhud, the trench, he didn't send people to fight while he stayed behind. He was on the battlefield, shoulder to shoulder with his companions. He took wounds, he took risks, and even when facing overwhelming odds, he never panicked. His calmness wasn't naive, it was grounded in faith and preparation. He used terrain, surprise, intelligence, and morale in ways that military historians still analyze today. But more than tactics, he cultivated belief. He built an army of people who weren't just fighting battles, they were living a purpose. He unified the Aus and Khazraj, tribes who had hated each other for generations. He brought Qurayshi elites and Abyssinian slaves into the same brotherhood. Under his leadership, Medina wasn't just a city, it became the prototype for a just society. The Constitution of Medina guaranteed rights to Muslims and non-Muslims alike, establishing rule of law in a place that had never known it before. What shocks many historians is how quickly and deeply the changes he introduced took root. That's the mark of true leadership. Real transformation doesn't need centuries when it's built on truth, character, and clarity. And long after he passed, the impact of his leadership carried forward. His companions didn't fall apart without him, they carried the mission across continents. So when you ask how a man with no army, no wealth, and no political machinery became the most influential leader in human history, the answer is simple: because he didn't just lead people, he awakened them. He didn't create followers, he created leaders, and in doing so, he built a movement that outlived empires and still shapes hearts today. What made the early Muslims unstoppable wasn't the size of their army, the strength of their weapons, or the sophistication of their tactics. It was what they carried inside. At a time when the world was driven by greed, pride, and the pursuit of domination, the Muslims were fueled by something radically different: faith. Their motivation wasn't to gain territory, riches, or status. They were driven by a deep, unwavering belief that they were standing for truth, fulfilling a divine command, and serving a cause greater than themselves. Compare that with the superpowers they faced. The Byzantine and Persian empires were deeply entrenched in materialism and power politics. Their wars were motivated by pride, expansion, and control. They taxed their people heavily, maintained rigid class systems, and often engaged in battles that left their populations exhausted and spiritually empty. Their soldiers fought because they were paid or forced. Their governments operated through fear and hierarchy. Morality for them was often just a tool to preserve power. Now contrast that with a small group of believers from Arabia. These were people who had once been oppressed in Mecca, tortured, exiled, and mocked. But now, they stood in front of imperial legions with confidence. Why? Because their motivation wasn't tied to this world. They believed in accountability before God. They believed that life was temporary, and that real success wasn't victory on a battlefield, it was staying true to the message regardless of the outcome. That kind of motivation is rare, it produces a different kind of courage. These Muslims didn't just face their enemies, they often faced death with calmness, even joy. They believed that victory was already written as long as they remained sincere, and because of that belief, they couldn't be bribed, broken, or shaken. This is what gave them an edge that superpowers couldn't understand. When an empire fights for land, it needs soldiers. When a movement fights for truth, it produces believers. That's what Islam did. It wasn't spreading through fear or force, it was spreading through the power of example. People saw how Muslims lived, how they treated others, how they stayed disciplined even under pressure. Their personal integrity became their most powerful weapon. This faith-based motivation also created an extraordinary sense of discipline. Early Muslims didn't just pray, they built community. They didn't just fast, they controlled their egos. They didn't just give charity, they redefined economic justice. Their belief system touched every part of their lives, making them not just warriors, but thinkers, builders, and reformers. And when they entered new lands, they didn't pillage or destroy, they often brought structure, fairness, and peace. Even the way they dealt with enemies was revolutionary. Prisoners of war were treated with respect. Agreements were honored, even when broken by the other side. The Prophet and his companions consistently showed mercy where revenge would have been expected. Why? Because their behavior wasn't dictated by impulse, it was guided by principle, and this is the real difference. The empires that Islam faced operated on domination. Islam operated on transformation. The Muslims weren't trying to become another empire. They were introducing an entirely new framework, one that saw all people as equal before God, one that didn't separate the spiritual from the political, one that called for both internal purification and external justice. So while the world looked at them and saw underdogs, what it didn't see was the fire of faith burning inside them, and that fire couldn't be put out with swords or treaties. It kept spreading because it offered something no empire could, meaning purpose and a connection to the divine. That's why they succeeded. That's why they won battles they should have lost. Because when you're not just fighting for land, but standing for eternal truth, you don't just become a soldier, you become a force that history can't ignore. The turning point in the conflict between Islam and the superpowers didn't come with massive armies or overwhelming numbers. It came through key battles, where faith, strategy, and vision intersected in ways that stunned the world. Two of the most decisive and symbolic confrontations were the Battle of Yarmouk against the Byzantine Empire, and the Battle of Qadisiyah against the Persian Empire. These weren't just military victories, they were moments that revealed the core difference between what Islam stood for and what the empires were fighting to preserve. The Battle of Yarmouk, fought in 63-6 CE, is one of the greatest military upsets in history. On one side you had the Byzantine Empire, the dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean. They had the numbers, the resources, and the experience. Their army was reportedly between 100,000 to 200,000 strong, composed of professional soldiers, well-armed and battle-hardened. On the other side stood the Muslim army, estimated to be around 30,000 to 40,000. They were fewer, less equipped, and relatively new to large-scale warfare. Yet they had one thing that the Byzantines lacked: complete unity of purpose. Khalid ibn al-Walid, one of the greatest military minds in Islamic history, led the Muslim forces. His strategy was nothing short of genius. He used the terrain to his advantage, choosing a battlefield that limited the Byzantines' ability to maneuver and bring their full force to bear. He organized his troops into flexible units, able to respond quickly to pressure points and flank attacks. But more than tactics, he instilled in his soldiers the mindset that they were not fighting for land or wealth, they were fighting for the truth of Islam, for justice, and for the hereafter. The Byzantines, despite their massive army, were disjointed. Many of their soldiers were conscripts, their ranks were filled with ethnic and religious divisions, and their morale was low. When the battle stretched over several days, the discipline, courage, and endurance of the Muslim forces began to break the enemy's spirit. On the final day, the Byzantine army collapsed. Thousands were killed and the Muslim forces secured a victory that permanently changed the power dynamics in the Levant. The fall of Byzantine control in Syria and the surrounding regions began with that single battle. Around the same time in the east, the Muslims faced another giant, the Sassanid Persian Empire. The Battle of Qadisiyah, also in 636 CE, would become the gateway to the fall of one of the oldest and most sophisticated empires in history. The Persian army had war elephants, armored divisions, and centuries of battlefield dominance. The Muslims again were outnumbered and had far fewer resources, but what they had was unbreakable resolve. Under the leadership of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, the Muslim forces maintained strict discipline, fought with intelligence, and remained spiritually focused throughout the multi-day battle. The Persians relied on their war elephants to break enemy lines, but the Muslims developed adaptive tactics to deal with them, targeting the elephants' handlers and creating confusion in the Persian ranks. What stands out most about both these battles is that they weren't won purely through brute force, they were won through adaptability, clarity of purpose, and spiritual resilience. Muslim commanders consulted their troops, made decisions based on values, and relied not only on physical strength, but also on prayer and moral certainty. The troops prayed before battles, sought forgiveness, and reminded each other of the eternal rewards of martyrdom and sincerity. These victories shocked the world. They shattered the myth that the Muslim community was too young, too small, or too under-equipped to take on the greatest empires. And they sent a message: this was not just a political movement, it was a divinely guided mission. The fall of Roman Syria and Persian Iraq didn't just happen because of military brilliance, it happened because the Muslims believed that they were agents of justice and mercy, sent not to conquer for themselves, but to liberate others from the oppression of false gods and corrupt rulers. These battles didn't just change borders, they changed the course of history, and they proved that when purpose meets preparation, even the most powerful forces on earth can fall. When the dust settled and the swords were sheathed, what Islam brought to the world was not just a shift in political control, it was a complete redefinition of what civilization could look like. The early Muslim conquests didn't leave a trail of destruction behind them, they brought a new order built on justice, knowledge, and spiritual purpose. That's what truly shocked the world, not just that the Muslims defeated two superpowers, but how they ruled afterward. It was unlike anything those empires had ever seen. The Byzantines and Persians had been obsessed with maintaining hierarchy and elite power. Their empires were marked by rigid class systems, ethnic favoritism, and central governments that drained wealth from their population. The state was supreme, and the average person, especially those who didn't share the ruling class's religion or background, had little protection or dignity. Taxes were crushing, corruption was rampant, and religious minorities were often persecuted or heavily restricted. Now enter the early Islamic rule. Instead of replacing one oppressive empire with another, the Muslims introduced a system that prioritized justice over politics and morality over conquest. In every region that came under Islamic governance, from Syria to Egypt to Persia, people encountered something astonishing: rulers who lived simply, judges who didn't bend for the powerful, and laws that protected even the non-Muslim citizens of the state. Islam introduced the concept of dhimma, a protection status for Jews, Christians, and other religious minorities. These groups were allowed to live, worship, and manage their internal affairs freely in return for a modest tax, jizya, which was often far lower than the oppressive taxes they had been paying under previous regimes. But it didn't stop at tolerance. The Muslims actively encouraged learning and intellectual growth. They built institutions, masjids, courts, schools, that weren't just symbols of power, but places where the average person could access knowledge and justice. Arabic became a unifying language, not just of governance, but of science, philosophy, and spirituality. Within just a few decades of the conquests, cities like Damascus, Kufa, Basra, and later Baghdad began to emerge as centers of scholarship and debate, and the governance model, it was revolutionary. Leaders were held accountable to the law. The caliphs didn't see themselves as divine figures or inheritors of a bloodline, but as servants of the people and representatives of divine guidance. Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second caliph, walked the streets at night to ensure no one was hungry. When a woman once challenged him publicly on a legal matter, he accepted her correction without arrogance. This was leadership grounded in humility, not ego. Justice was no longer for the elite, it applied to all. And this is where Islam truly flipped the script. The real strength of the Muslim world wasn't just military, it was ethical. People converted not by force but by observation. They saw a system where equality wasn't just preached but practiced, where a poor person could take a wealthy man to court and win, where rulers were expected to fear God more than they feared rebellion. In many regions, the local populations actually welcomed Muslim rule. They had grown tired of imperial exploitation and religious oppression. Islam didn't just free them from one empire, it gave them a sense of dignity, participation, and spiritual purpose. The conquered became contributors. Within a generation, Persians, Syrians, Copts, and Berbers were not just subjects, they were scholars, governors, and military leaders within the Islamic world. This was the real shock. Islam didn't just defeat superpowers, it replaced their broken systems with something better, a system that valued knowledge over privilege, mercy over domination, and truth over tribalism. And centuries later, long after those empires had vanished into the ruins of history, the Islamic civilization they helped ignite continued to shine, producing philosophers, scientists, theologians, poets, and leaders whose influence is still felt today. Because Islam didn't rise to destroy, it rose to elevate. It offered not just a new ruler, but a new way to live. So let's step back for a moment and really look at what just happened here. A message that began in a cave, a man with no army, no wealth, no political power, a group of believers mocked, tortured, and cast out by their own people, ended up shaking the foundations of two of the greatest superpowers in human history. But Islam didn't just win on the battlefield, it won in the hearts of people. It transformed individuals, redefined leadership, and built a civilization rooted in justice, mercy, knowledge, and purpose. And the most shocking part, the tools they used weren't swords and politics, they were faith, vision, discipline, and unwavering belief in truth. The world had never seen anything like it. Superpowers were brought to their knees, not by brute force, but by a moral revolution. Islam didn't just defeat empires, it exposed their cracks. It offered a model that was fairer, wiser, and more humane. And here's what I want you to take away. This wasn't just history, this was a blueprint, a reminder that real change doesn't start with armies or thrones, it starts with clarity of purpose, with people who believe deeply, live sincerely, and act courageously. The truth is, Islam didn't rise because it chased power, it rose because it stood for truth. And when truth stands firm, no empire, no force, no superpower can stand against it. That's how Islam defeated the superpowers. And now you know the truth. It's not just shocking, it's inspiring.